The brass door handle felt ice cold beneath Amara Sinclair's trembling fingertips. She stood frozen outside the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, her emerald silk dress rustling softly in the evening breeze that swept through the marble foyer. This was supposed to be her night. 8 months of planning, coordinating, and organizing had led to this moment, the annual charity gala that she had poured her heart into. The scent of white gardenias from the towering entrance arrangement mingled with her familiar perfume, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Through the ornate glass doors, she could see the golden glow of crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across elegantly dressed guests. The soft murmur of conversation and gentle clink of champagne glasses should have felt welcoming, but instead it made her stomach churn with anxiety. Her grandmother's pearl earrings, worn to every important event since her wedding day, felt heavier than usual against her neck. These pearls had been her symbol of dignity, of belonging to something greater than herself. But tonight, they felt like a weight pulling her down into uncertainty. This morning had shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. The phone call from the event coordinator still echoed in her ears like a cruel joke. "Mrs. Sinclair, there's been a change regarding your attendance tonight. Please call me immediately." When she'd called back, her hands shaking as she dialed, the woman's uncomfortable stammering had made everything clear. "I'm so sorry, but there seems to have been some confusion. Your name isn't on the guest list. Mr. Sinclair said there was a family emergency, and you wouldn't be able to attend." A family emergency. 20 years of marriage, and her husband Richard had fabricated a family emergency to keep her away from the event she had spent months organizing. The event that was supposed to celebrate their shared commitment to the community, their partnership in making a difference. Now, as she finally gathered the courage to push open that heavy door, her breath caught in her throat like a fishhook snagging fabric. The ballroom spread before her in all its elegant glory. Round tables draped in ivory linens, centerpieces of blush roses and baby's breath, the very decorations she had personally selected and approved. But it was the sight near the champagne fountain that made her knees buckle and her vision blur at the edges. There was Richard, looking devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His salt and pepper hair was styled just the way she liked it, and his smile was the same charming one that had won her heart all those years ago. But his arm was wrapped around the waist of a stunning blonde woman who couldn't have been older than 28. The woman wore a breathtaking Tiffany necklace, the exact same one Amara had admired in the store window just last month, the one Richard had dismissed as too expensive and impractical. But it wasn't the necklace that made her world tilt off its axis. It was hearing Richard's voice, warm and confident, as he introduced the young woman to their longtime friends, the Hendersons. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Jessica." "Jessica, these are our dear friends from the tennis club." "My wife, Jessica." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and making her grab the doorframe for support. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of building a life together, and he was introducing another woman as his wife to people who had watched Amara and Richard build their relationship from the ground up. Before we dive deeper into this moment that changed everything for Amara, I want you to pause with me for just a moment. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, questioned your worth, or wondered if your voice really matters, then you're exactly who I create these stories for. Hit that subscribe button and join our Weathered Rose Stories family. We're building a community of women who understand that our struggles don't define us. Our courage in overcoming them does. And make sure to hit the bell so you never miss a story of resilience, transformation, and the strength that lives inside every woman's heart. 6 months earlier, this same ballroom had been filled with a different kind of energy. Amara had stood at the head of the oak-paneled conference room adjacent to the main hall, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her one of the most sought-after diversity and inclusion consultants in the region. She was in her element, leading the charity committee meeting with the kind of strategic thinking that had helped 3 major corporations completely transform their workplace cultures. The silent auction items need to be arranged by estimated value, she had explained to the dozen committee members gathered around the polished mahogany table. We want to create a natural flow that encourages bidding without making anyone feel excluded. Her notes were perfectly organized, her timeline realistic, and her vision clear. This was the Amara who commanded respect in boardrooms, who could walk into a hostile corporate environment and emerge with a comprehensive plan for positive change. But everything shifted the moment Richard walked into that conference room. It was as if someone had dimmed her inner light with a switch. Her shoulders curved inward almost imperceptibly. Her voice became softer, more deferential. She began glancing at him for approval even as she spoke about decisions she had already made and strategies she'd already developed. "Honey, don't you think we should focus more on the entertainment budget?" Richard had interrupted, not looking up from his phone. "Some of these decoration costs seem excessive." Amara had immediately begun defending choices she had made with careful consideration and expert knowledge, explaining her reasoning as if she were a child who had been caught making poor decisions. The committee members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances that spoke volumes about what they were witnessing. This pattern had become the rhythm of their life together. At home, Amara's mornings began at 6 o'clock sharp, not because she was naturally an early riser, but because Richard expected his coffee prepared exactly the way he liked it. Dark roast with a splash of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug his mother had given them for their 5th anniversary. She would listen to his complaints about his business partnerships, his frustrations with clients, his criticisms of colleagues, nodding sympathetically and offering gentle encouragement. She managed his schedule with the precision of a professional assistant, coordinating his golf games, business dinners, and social obligations. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and important meetings that he forgot. She handled the emotional labor of their relationship while he received credit for their social success and professional connections. Their friends often told her how lucky she was to have such a successful husband, not seeing the exhaustion in her eyes or recognizing how carefully she orchestrated every aspect of his public image. They didn't notice how she had slowly shrunk to accommodate his expanding sense of importance, or how her own accomplishments were always framed in relation to how they supported his goals. The cracks had been appearing for months, maybe even years, but Amara had become an expert at spackling over them with explanations and excuses. Richard's phone was always face down when they were together now, and he guarded it with the protectiveness of someone hiding secrets. When she asked about his day, his responses became shorter and more dismissive. When she shared stories about her consulting work, he would change the subject or find something to criticize about her approach. His comments about her appearance had grown sharper and more frequent. "Maybe you should try that new gym downtown," he would suggest, looking at her with a critical eye that made her feel exposed and inadequate. "I saw Linda Patterson there last week, and she looks incredible for her age." The implication was clear. Amara, at 42, was somehow failing to maintain herself to his standards. In social settings, his jokes about her age or her habits drew uncomfortable laughter from their friends. "You know how women get when they hit their 40s, he would say, with a conspiratorial wink. "Everything becomes a crisis." These comments always came disguised as harmless teasing, but they chipped away at her confidence like water wearing down stone. Amara had developed an elaborate internal system for making excuses for his behavior. He was stressed about work. He was going through a difficult time with his business partner. He was worried about his aging father. She had become so skilled at rewriting his cruelty as concern, his dismissiveness as distraction, that she barely recognized what was happening to her own sense of self. Her best friend Sandy Mitchell had been watching these changes with growing concern. Sandy, a straight-talking real estate agent who had known Amara since their college days, had started asking pointed questions that Amara deflected with practiced ease. "You seem different lately," Sandy had said during their last lunch together, studying Amara's face with the intensity of someone who cared deeply. "Smaller, somehow, like you're trying to take up less space in your own life." "Don't be ridiculous," Amara had laughed, but the sound was hollow even to her own ears. "I'm just busy with the gala planning. You know how consuming these big events can be." But Sandy wasn't fooled. She had watched Amara command corporate boardrooms with confidence and grace. She had seen her stand up to powerful executives who tried to minimize her expertise. This new version of Amara, the one who apologized for existing and sought permission to have opinions, was a stranger wearing her best friend's face. Eleanor Thompson, the 72-year-old volunteer coordinator who had been working with the charity for over a decade, had also begun to notice troubling patterns. Eleanor had survived her own difficult marriage decades earlier, and she recognized the signs of a woman who was slowly disappearing into someone else's expectations. "That husband of yours seems to have strong opinions about everything," Eleanor had commented after one particularly tense committee meeting where Richard had contradicted several of Amara's decisions. "Does he always speak for you in public?" The question had hit Amara like a slap, mostly because she couldn't immediately answer it. When had she stopped speaking for herself? When had her voice become an echo of his preferences? Meanwhile, Jessica Monroe had been quietly inserting herself into Richard's professional life with the efficiency of someone who understood opportunity when she saw it. At 28, she was Richard's new administrative assistant, hired 6 months earlier to help manage his expanding consulting firm. She was beautiful in an effortless way that made Amara feel overdressed and overly deliberate by comparison. Jessica had been helping Richard with various projects, staying late at the office, accompanying him to client meetings, and gradually becoming his go-to person for everything from scheduling to strategic planning. When Amara asked about her, Richard's responses were always dismissive. "She's just an employee, Amara. Don't be paranoid." But Amara wasn't paranoid. She was observant. She noticed how Richard's face lit up when he talked about Jessica's ideas. She saw how he defended Jessica's suggestions with enthusiasm while dismissing Amara's with barely concealed impatience. She felt the shift in energy when Jessica's name came up in conversation, like a light had been turned on in a room that had been growing progressively darker. The signs were all there, painted in bold strokes across the canvas of their daily life. But Amara had become so skilled at not seeing what was directly in front of her that she attributed everything to work stress, middle-age changes, and the natural evolution of a long marriage. What Amara didn't realize was that the life she'd spent 20 years building was already crumbling around her. Sometimes, we're the last to see what everyone else can sense. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's version of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience might help another woman recognize her own worth. Richard had been working later and later, taking mysterious phone calls that he would step outside to answer, and showing progressively less interest in the gala planning, despite it being their signature social event of the year. When she asked about his lack of involvement, he would sigh with the weariness of someone being asked to explain something obvious to a child. "I trust you to handle the details, Amara," he would say in a tone that somehow made her feel both dismissed and burdened. "You're so much better at that kind of thing than I am." She had internalized his lack of engagement as evidence of his confidence in her abilities, not recognizing it as the beginning of his systematic withdrawal from their shared life. She didn't see that he was already building a different life, one that didn't include her. The morning of the gala had started with small discoveries that, in hindsight, were earthquakes disguised as tremors. Amara had been trying to post a photo of the beautiful centerpieces on their shared social media accounts when she discovered that she could no longer access them. The passwords had been changed, and her administrative privileges had been revoked. When she called their bank to confirm the timing of a payment for the venue, she learned that her name had been removed as an emergency contact on their primary checking account. The customer service representative, confused by Amara's distress, explained that Mr. Sinclair had updated his contact information and removed secondary users for security purposes. She found unpaid bills that she had never seen, credit cards in her name that had been maxed out without her knowledge, and official-looking documents that suggested financial changes she had never agreed to or even been told about. When she confronted Richard about these discoveries, his response was swift and devastating in its casual cruelty. "You're being paranoid, Amara," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "Maybe you should talk to someone about your insecurity. It's becoming concerning." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment she questioned her own perception of reality. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe she was imagining problems that didn't exist. Maybe her anxiety about the gala was making her see conspiracies where there were only ordinary administrative changes. But then came the phone call from the event coordinator that shattered her remaining illusions. The awkward conversation revealed that Richard had personally called to have Amara removed from the guest list for the very event she had spent 8 months organizing. He had claimed there was a family emergency and that she wouldn't be able to attend. The coordinator had assumed it was a temporary illness or family crisis, not knowing about the deeper deception taking place. She was genuinely confused by Amara's distress and disbelief, clearly expecting gratitude for Richard's thoughtful handling of a difficult situation. Amara experienced the news like a physical assault. Disbelief crashed into anger, which collided with confusion, which dissolved into a shame so deep it made her bones ache. She realized with crystal clarity that she had no legal recourse, because technically Richard was the co-chair of the event. He had outmaneuvered her in her own social circle, using her trust and love as weapons against her. Instead of staying home as Richard had clearly expected her to do, Amara made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to the gala anyway. She didn't have a plan, didn't have a strategy, didn't even have a clear understanding of what she hoped to accomplish. All she had was a desperate need to understand what was happening to the life she had spent 2 decades building. She arrived late, parking in the back lot away from the valet service, and spent several minutes watching through the tall windows that lined the ballroom. She could see the event unfolding exactly as she had planned it. The carefully arranged lighting, the strategic placement of auction items, the flow of guests that she had orchestrated with months of careful planning. But she was watching it from the outside, like a ghost haunting her own life. When she finally gathered the courage to enter through those brass-handled doors, she discovered a scene that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her own existence. Richard wasn't just attending the gala with another woman. He was living an entirely different life, one in which Amara had been completely erased and replaced. As she stood there in the doorway listening to him introduce Jessica as his wife to people who had known them as a couple for decades, Amara felt something crack open inside her chest. It wasn't her heart breaking. It was something deeper and more fundamental. It was the sound of a woman finally seeing the truth of her own life and recognizing that everything she thought she knew had been carefully constructed fiction. The guests who noticed her arrival responded with a mixture of confusion and discomfort that confirmed her worst fears. Word had somehow spread that she was having difficulties and might be experiencing some kind of breakdown. Richard had planted seeds of doubt about her mental stability throughout their social circle, creating a narrative that would make her appear unstable if she protested too loudly about what was happening to her. Some people actively avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with what they perceived as an awkward social situation. Others approached her with forced sympathy, asking if she was getting help and suggesting that she should go home and rest. The narrative Richard had constructed was taking hold with frightening efficiency, and Amara realized that her own friends were beginning to see her through the lens of his manipulation. It was in this moment of complete social isolation that Eleanor Thompson proved herself to be more than just a volunteer coordinator. Eleanor had been observing the entire situation with the sharp eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize patterns of cruelty. She had seen this kind of systematic character assassination before. It had happened to her own daughter 20 years earlier. Eleanor quietly approached Amara and suggested they step outside for some air. Her gentle but firm guidance felt like a lifeline to a drowning woman, and Amara followed her out to the garden terrace where they could speak privately. "I've been watching what's happening in there," Eleanor said softly, her weathered hands gripping the stone balustrade, "and I want you to know that what you're seeing is real. You're not imagining it, and you're not losing your mind." The validation hit Amara like a physical force, and she felt tears spring to her eyes for the first time that evening. Someone had witnessed what was happening to her. Someone else could see the systematic campaign to erase her from her own life. Eleanor went on to explain what she had observed over the past several months. Richard coaching Jessica on how to respond to questions about Amara, spreading carefully crafted stories about Amara's mental health struggles, and systematically working to isolate her from their shared social connections. "This isn't sudden, dear," Eleanor said with the gentle authority of experience. "This has been planned for a very long time. He's been building a new life while systematically dismantling yours." As the two women stood together in the cool evening air, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of music from the ballroom, Amara began to understand that her humiliation was not an accident or a moment of poor judgment. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to erase her from the life they had built together, replacing her so seamlessly that most people wouldn't even notice the substitution. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it meant that her marriage had been a lie for longer than she could bear to calculate. Liberating because it meant that her instincts had been correct, her observations valid, and her sense of reality intact. She wasn't losing her mind. She was finally finding her way back to the truth. Chapter 2. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the numbness that had settled over Amara like a heavy blanket. She sat at Sandy's kitchen table, still wearing the emerald dress from the night before, mascara smudged beneath her eyes like war paint from a battle she didn't know she had been fighting. Sandy moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a friend is simply bear witness to their pain. She placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of Amara, the familiar ritual a small anchor in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. "We need to document everything," Eleanor said from her seat across the table. She had arrived at 7 in the morning with a yellow legal pad and the kind of determination that comes from watching too many women lose everything because they trusted the wrong people. What Richard did last night wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. And if it was strategic, it means there's more. Eleanor was right, of course. Over the next several days, with Sandy's help and Eleanor's guidance, Amara began the painful process of investigating her own life. What they discovered was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its implications. The financial manipulation was systematic and sophisticated. Joint bank accounts had been slowly drained over the course of 18 months, with small transfers that never triggered alerts or raised questions. Credit cards in Amara's name had been opened and maxed out, creating debt she never knew existed. Her name had been quietly removed from property deeds, investment accounts, and insurance policies. "Look at this," Sandy said, pointing to a stack of documents they had requested from their mortgage company. "He refinanced the house 6 months ago and removed you from the deed. You've been living in a house you no longer legally own. The cruelty was in the details. Richard had used Amara's own Social Security number and personal information to create this web of financial deception, but he had done it in such a way that she appeared to be either complicit or incompetent. If anyone looked at the paperwork, it would seem like Amara had either agreed to these changes or been too careless to notice them happening. But the financial manipulation was only part of the story. The character assassination campaign was even more insidious. Through careful conversations with friends and acquaintances, Amara began to understand how thoroughly Richard had been undermining her reputation for months. He had told the Hendersons that Amara was going through a difficult time and might be experiencing some mental health challenges. He had confided in their golf partners that he was worried about Amara's stability and didn't know how to help her. He had suggested to their neighbors that Amara's behavior had become erratic and concerning. None of these conversations were obviously malicious. They were positioned as the worried confessions of a concerned husband who was dealing with a wife's mental decline. But together, they created a narrative that would make anything Amara said or did appear to be evidence of her instability. "It's brilliant, in the most evil way possible," Eleanor observed as they mapped out the timeline of Richard's campaign. "He's made it so that if you try to tell the truth about what he's doing, you'll sound exactly like what he's convinced everyone you are, a paranoid woman having a breakdown." The documentation process was emotionally exhausting, but it was also empowering in a way Amara hadn't expected. Each piece of evidence they uncovered was proof that her instincts had been correct, that her observations were valid, that she wasn't losing her mind. She started keeping a detailed journal of Richard's lies and manipulations, noting times, dates, and witnesses whenever possible. She opened her own bank account at a different institution, using her maiden name and an address Richard didn't know about. She changed her social media passwords and began documenting the campaign against her with screenshots and saved messages. Each small action felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been stolen. For the first time in months, maybe years, she was taking action instead of simply reacting to someone else's choices. As word of the Gala incident spread through their social circle, something unexpected began to happen. Other women started reaching out to Amara privately, sharing their own stories of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and systematic erasure. Maria Santos, a woman from the country club, called to share that her own divorce had followed a similar pattern. "My ex-husband convinced everyone I was an alcoholic," she confided. "He would encourage me to have wine at social events, then point out my drinking problem to anyone who would listen. By the time I realized what was happening, half our friends thought I was a drunk and the other half thought I was crazy." Linda Patterson, who Richard had mentioned admiringly just weeks before, stopped by Sandy's house to tell Amara about her own experience with financial manipulation. "My husband had been moving money for 2 years before I found out," she said, her voice shaking with remembered anger. "He made it look like I was the one making poor financial decisions. The bank actually suggested I might need help managing my money." Each conversation revealed the same pattern: systematic campaigns designed to make women doubt their own perceptions, isolated from their support networks, and financially vulnerable. Amara began to understand that what had happened to her wasn't personal, it was tactical. Richard hadn't targeted her because of some unique flaw or failure on her part. He had targeted her because she was convenient, trusting, and emotionally invested in their relationship. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that her love and loyalty had been used as weapons against her. Liberating because it meant that she wasn't uniquely flawed or particularly foolish. She was one of many women who had been deliberately deceived by someone they trusted. Sandy watched her friend's transformation with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. "You're getting stronger," she observed one evening as they sat in her living room, surrounded by boxes of documents and evidence. "I can see it in the way you hold yourself. You're standing up straighter." It was true. Amara was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of accommodation and apology. Her professional identity, which had been overshadowed by her role as Richard's wife, began to resurface. She reached out to former clients and colleagues, reconnecting with the version of herself who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms and created meaningful change in complex organizations. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, the CEO of a nonprofit she had worked with 2 years earlier, was delighted to hear from her. "Amara, I was just thinking about you last week. We're dealing with some internal culture issues that are right in your wheelhouse. Do you have time for a consultation?" The conversation reminded Amara that she had skills, expertise, and professional value that existed completely independently of her relationship with Richard. She was good at what she did. She was respected in her field. She had helped organizations navigate complex changes and difficult transitions. If she could help corporations transform their cultures, surely she could figure out how to transform her own life. The opportunity that would become Amara's first real step toward empowerment came from an unexpected source. The Riverside Community Center was hosting a series of workshops on domestic abuse awareness, and they needed someone to speak about emotional abuse and financial manipulation. "You should do it," Sandy urged when she saw the flyer. "Your experience, your professional background, your ability to articulate what's happening. You could help so many women." The idea terrified Amara. Speaking publicly about her personal humiliation felt like social suicide. She had spent her entire adult life maintaining appearances, avoiding conflict, and protecting her privacy. The thought of standing in front of strangers and admitting that her marriage was a lie made her feel physically sick. But Eleanor had a different perspective. "Your pain has a purpose, Amara," she said, with the gentle firmness that had become so important to Amara's healing. "Don't let him steal that, too. Every woman who hears your story will recognize something in her own life. Your courage to speak truth could save someone else from years of confusion and self-doubt." After a sleepless night of internal debate, Amara made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She called the community center and volunteered to speak at their next workshop. Evening of the workshop, Amara stood in the bathroom of the community center, staring at herself in the unflattering fluorescent lighting. She wore a simple navy blue dress and minimal makeup, having learned that appearing too polished could make people distrust the reality of abuse. Her hands shook as she gripped the sink, and she could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered to her reflection. "You just have to be honest." The meeting room held about 30 women of various ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds. Some looked skeptical, others curious, and a few appeared to be fighting back tears before Amara even began speaking. She took a deep breath and started with the truth. 3 weeks ago, I was banned from attending a charity gala that I had spent 8 months organizing. She began, her voice stronger than she had expected. "My husband told the event coordinator there was a family emergency. Then he showed up to that same event with another woman, introducing her as his wife to people who had known us as a couple for 20 years. The room was completely silent, but Amara could feel the energy shifting. Some women leaned forward, recognizing something familiar in her story. Others nodded with the bitter understanding of shared experience. She went on to describe the months of gaslighting, the systematic financial manipulation, the careful campaign to make her doubt her own perceptions. She explained how emotional abuse often leaves no visible bruises but creates wounds that cut just as deep. "The cruelest part," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was that he convinced me I was imagining it. He made me doubt my own memories, my own observations, my own sanity. For months, I thought I was losing my mind, It wasn't until I started documenting everything that I realized I wasn't crazy. I was being deliberately driven to question my own reality. When she finished speaking, the response was overwhelming. Women lined up to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice about situations they had never been able to name or describe. The questions came rapid fire. How did you know it wasn't your fault? What made you finally see what was happening? How do you document something that leaves no bruises? How do you convince people to believe you when he seems so reasonable? Amara answered each question with the honesty that had made her presentation so powerful. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she offered the perspective of someone who had walked through the fire and emerged with clarity about what had happened to her. During the question and answer session, she learned something that shook her to her core. Richard had been telling people in their social circle that she had suffered a mental breakdown after discovering she was going through menopause. He had suggested that her hormones were making her unpredictable and paranoid, and that he was trying to protect her by limiting her social exposure. One woman, Janet Williams, raised her hand during the Q&A session. "I think I know your husband," she said hesitantly. "Richard Sterling, right? He asked me to keep an eye on you because he was worried you might become dangerous to yourself or others." The revelation hit Amara like a physical blow. Richard hadn't just been undermining her credibility. He had been actively recruiting people to monitor her behavior and report back to him. He had turned their mutual friends into unwitting participants in his surveillance campaign. But instead of feeling defeated by this revelation, Amara felt something unexpected: rage. Clean, pure, justified anger that burned away the last vestiges of self-doubt and confusion. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't imagining things. She was the target of a systematic campaign designed to destroy her credibility and isolate her from her support network. "Thank you for telling me that," Amara said to Janet, her voice steady and clear, "because now I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I can plan accordingly." After the workshop, women approached Amara individually to share more personal stories. Sarah Martinez told her about financial accounts that had been emptied without her knowledge. Rebecca Thompson described a campaign of social isolation that had left her questioning her own worth. Patricia Davis explained how her ex-husband had convinced her family that she was mentally unstable. Each story reinforced the same truth. What had happened to Amara was not unique, but it was also not acceptable. There were other women who had survived similar campaigns and rebuilt their lives. There were resources available, legal protections that could be invoked, and strategies for documenting and addressing emotional abuse. As she drove home that night, Amara felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to a sinking ship, but the steady confidence of someone who had found solid ground beneath her feet. She had spoken her truth in public, and the sky hadn't fallen. People had believed her, supported her, and shared their own experiences of survival and recovery. Her pain had purpose, just as Eleanor had promised. For the first time since that terrible night at the Gala, Amara began to imagine a future that didn't include Richard's manipulation, gaslighting, and systematic cruelty. She began to envision a life where her voice mattered, where her perceptions were trusted, where her strength was recognized and celebrated. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back to the small, apologetic version of herself that had accepted crumbs and called them a feast. The real Amara, the one who had commanded corporate boardrooms and created meaningful change in complex organizations, was finally ready to fight for her own life with the same passion and skill she had always brought to helping others. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Amara was no longer fighting alone, and she was no longer fighting blind. Chapter 3. Word of Amara's community center presentation spread faster than she had anticipated. Within days, she received calls from other organizations asking her to speak about emotional abuse and financial manipulation. The local newspaper wanted to interview her about domestic violence awareness. A podcast focused on women's empowerment reached out about featuring her story. At first, the attention felt overwhelming and terrifying. Amara had spent her entire adult life avoiding public scrutiny, carefully maintaining a polished image that revealed nothing vulnerable or imperfect. The idea of being known for her pain rather than her accomplishments felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked to build. But Sandy helped her see it differently. "You're not being known for your pain," she pointed out during one of their evening conversations. "You're being known for your courage. There's a difference." The interview with Lisa Chen from the Riverside Gazette was Amara's first experience with public media attention. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, and Lisa's questions were thoughtful and respectful, but they still required Amara to revisit details she would have preferred to forget. "What was the moment you realized this wasn't just marital problems, but something more systematic?" Lisa asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Amara thought carefully before answering. "When I discovered that he had been having conversations about my mental health with people I barely knew. That's when I understood that this wasn't just neglect or midlife crisis behavior. This was strategic." The article, when it was published, was fair and accurate, but seeing her story in print felt surreal. The headline read, "Local Woman Speaks Out About Financial and Emotional Abuse After Public Humiliation." Beneath it was a photo of Amara sitting in the community center, looking serious but determined. Richard's response to the article was swift and calculated. Within hours of publication, Amara's phone began ringing with calls from concerned friends who had heard troubling things about her mental state. "Richard is saying you've had some kind of breakdown," her sister Jennifer called to report. "He's telling people that you're making false accusations because you can't accept that your marriage is over. He sounds so reasonable and concerned. If I didn't know you better, I might believe him." But the most devastating blow came when Amara received a formal letter from Richard's attorney. He was filing papers claiming that she was mentally unstable and requesting a psychological evaluation. The legal documents painted her as a woman having a midlife crisis who'd become delusional and potentially dangerous. The papers requested temporary control of their shared assets for her protection and suggested that her recent public statements were evidence of her deteriorating mental condition. They cited her erratic behavior at social events and her public claims of persecution as proof that she needed professional intervention. Amara sat in her car outside the post office, reading the legal documents with hands that shook so violently she could barely hold the papers steady. The language was clinical and devastating, describing her in terms that made her sound like a stranger to herself. Respondent has exhibited increasingly paranoid behavior, making unfounded accusations against petitioner and creating public disturbances. Respondent's recent statements to media and community organizations suggest a disconnection from reality that poses risks to both herself and others. The cruelty was breathtaking. Richard was using her courage to speak truth as evidence of her mental instability. Her decision to help other women was being twisted into proof that she was dangerous and delusional. When she called Sandy, she could barely speak through her tears. "He's going to destroy me," she sobbed into the phone. "He's going to take everything and make everyone believe I'm crazy. And maybe I am crazy. Maybe I am imagining all of this." Sandy was at her door within 20 minutes, with Eleanor close behind. They found Amara curled up on her couch, still clutching the legal papers, looking smaller and more fragile than either of them had ever seen her. "This is what abusers do when their victims start telling the truth," Eleanor said firmly, taking the papers from Amara's hands and reading them with the expression of someone who had seen this playbook before. "They escalate. They make the cost of truth-telling so high that you'll choose silence instead." But the legal assault was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Amara watched in horror as her social circle began to fracture. Some friends distanced themselves entirely, clearly uncomfortable with the drama and choosing to believe Richard's version of events rather than confront uncomfortable truths about emotional abuse. The Hendersons, who had been close friends for over a decade, sent a text message saying they thought it would be best for everyone if Amara got the help she needed before they socialized again. The tennis group she had been part of for 8 years quietly stopped, including her in their weekly games. Invitations to dinner parties and social gatherings simply stopped coming. This is the moment when Amara realized she had two choices: retreat back into silence and let Richard's version of her story become the truth, or fight for her own narrative. Every woman faces moments like this, when we must choose between peace and truth, between comfort and integrity. Have you ever had to choose between being liked and being authentic? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage might inspire another woman to choose truth over comfort. The financial pressure became crushing as legal bills mounted and assets remained frozen in contested accounts. Amara was forced to move in with Sandy temporarily, carrying her belongings in garbage. Bags like a refugee from her own life. The elegant home she had decorated with such care, the life she had spent 2 decades building, suddenly felt like ancient history. Eleanor helped her find Lisa Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in complex divorces involving emotional abuse and financial manipulation. Lisa's office was modest but efficient, filled with case files that told stories similar to Amara's, women who had been systematically undermined by partners they trusted. The good news, Lisa explained during their first consultation, is that what Richard has done isn't just morally wrong, it's legally actionable. Financial manipulation, character assassination, and the systematic isolation you've described can all be addressed in divorce proceedings. But Lisa also delivered sobering news about the challenges ahead. He's playing a sophisticated game, she explained. By filing the mental health petition first, he's put you in a defensive position. Every move you make now will be scrutinized as potential evidence of instability. The psychological evaluation that Richard had requested was scheduled for the following week. Amara would be required to undergo hours of testing and interviews with a court-appointed psychologist who would determine her mental fitness and credibility. "What if they decide he's right?" Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they conclude that I am having a breakdown?" Lisa's response was both reassuring and realistic. The psychologist will be looking for evidence of genuine mental illness, not normal responses to extraordinary stress. What you've experienced would cause anyone to feel anxious, depressed, and disoriented. The question is whether your perceptions of reality are accurate, not whether you're upset about your circumstances. But even with professional reassurance, Amara found herself questioning everything again. The gaslighting had been so thorough, so systematic, that she sometimes wondered if Richard was right about her mental state. Maybe she was imagining the financial manipulation. Maybe she was overreacting to normal marital problems. Maybe she was the problem, and everyone could see it except her. The dark night of her soul came on a rainy Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the legal papers were filed. Amara sat alone in Sandy's guest room, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal documents, feeling more isolated and uncertain than she had ever felt in her life. Her phone had been silent all day. No calls from friends, no messages of support, no contact from the outside world except for legal communications and court notifications. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that no longer belonged to her. The depression was physical, settling into her bones like a weight that made every movement exhausting. She hadn't eaten a full meal in days, and sleep came only in fragments punctuated by anxiety dreams where she was running through endless corridors, searching for something she could never find. In her darkest moments, she considered giving up entirely. Richard's legal team had presented a settlement offer that would give her enough money to start over somewhere else, but it came with a non-disclosure agreement that would silence her story forever. She could take the money, disappear quietly, and let Richard's version of events become the official record. The temptation was enormous. She could have financial security, an end to the legal battles, an escape from the daily humiliation of having her sanity questioned by people she had once considered friends. All she had to do was admit that she might have been wrong about everything and promise never to speak about it again. But as she sat in that dark room, surrounded by the evidence of Richard's systematic cruelty, something inside her rebelled against the idea of retreat. Eleanor's words echoed in her memory. "Your pain has a purpose. Don't let him steal that, too." The next morning brought an unexpected lifeline. Eleanor arrived at Sandy's house carrying a shoebox filled with letters and cards. "These came to the community center," she explained. "Women who heard you speak have been writing to thank you and share their own stories." Amara opened the first letter with trembling hands. It was from a woman named Maria who had attended the workshop 3 weeks earlier. "Dear Amara," the letter began, "I want you to know that your courage to speak truth saved my life. I had been living with financial manipulation and emotional abuse for 12 years, but I thought it was normal. I thought I was the problem. After hearing you speak, I finally understood what was happening to me. I left my husband last week, and for the first time in years, I can breathe. Thank you for showing me that I wasn't crazy and that I deserved better." Letter after letter told similar stories. Women who had recognized themselves in Amara's experience. Women who had found the courage to document abuse, seek legal help, or leave dangerous situations because someone had finally given them language for what was happening to them. "I thought I was losing my mind until I heard your story. You helped me understand that emotional abuse is real abuse. Thank you for showing me that I wasn't alone. Your courage gave me courage." Reading these letters, Amara understood something profound about the choice in front of her. This wasn't just about her personal battle with Richard anymore. It was about whether she would allow his campaign of cruelty to silence other women who needed to hear that they weren't imagining their own abuse. The psychological evaluation took place the following Tuesday in a sterile office building downtown. Dr. Patricia Williams was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put Amara at ease. "I've reviewed the allegations that have been made," Dr. Williams began, "and I want you to know that my job is to assess your mental state objectively, not to prove or disprove anyone else's claims about you." The evaluation lasted 4 hours and included cognitive testing, personality assessments, and extensive interviews about Amara's life history, recent experiences, and emotional responses to her current situation. "Can you tell me about the financial irregularities you discovered?" Dr. Williams asked, taking notes as Amara described the systematic manipulation of their accounts. "Do you have documentation of these claims? How has this situation affected your daily functioning? What support systems do you have in place?" When the evaluation was complete, Dr. Williams' preliminary observations were cautiously optimistic. "I don't see evidence of the kind of mental instability that would compromise your judgment or credibility," she told Amara. "What I see is someone who has been under enormous stress, responding in ways that are completely normal and appropriate to your circumstances." But the formal report wouldn't be available for another week, leaving Amara in limbo as the legal proceedings continued. Meanwhile, Richard escalated his public campaign against her. He appeared to be the perfect picture of a concerned husband dealing with a wife's mental breakdown. He attended social events with Jessica, introducing her as someone who was helping him through this difficult time. He spoke sadly about Amara's condition to anyone who would listen, always with the tone of someone bearing a heavy burden with grace and dignity. The contrast was devastating. While Amara was fighting for her credibility in courtrooms and doctors' offices, Richard was living his new life openly, garnering sympathy for his patience in dealing with such a difficult situation. But something was happening beneath the surface of Richard's carefully constructed narrative. Jessica was beginning to see inconsistencies in the stories he told about Amara and their marriage. Small details didn't add up, and Richard's explanations became more elaborate and contradictory over time. The revelation came when Jessica accidentally found Richard's phone unlocked and saw text messages that revealed the true nature of his campaign against Amara. Messages to friends describing strategies for isolating her, conversations with his lawyer about building the mental instability case, communications that showed calculated planning rather than genuine concern. Jessica confronted Richard that evening, and his response was telling. Instead of offering explanations or expressing remorse, he turned his manipulation tactics on her. Suddenly, Jessica was too emotional and didn't understand the complexity of the situation. She was taking things out of context and letting Amara's lies influence her judgment. For the first time, Jessica experienced firsthand the gaslighting and manipulation that Amara had been describing. The charm that had initially attracted her to Richard revealed itself as a carefully constructed mask that could be dropped whenever it was no longer useful. Jessica made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire legal battle. She contacted Lisa Rodriguez and offered to provide testimony about what she had witnessed and discovered. "I need you to understand," Jessica told Lisa during their first meeting. "I'm not proud of my role in this. I believed his version of events because I wanted to believe him. But I can't continue to be part of something that I now know is deliberate cruelty." Jessica's testimony would prove to be devastating to Richard's case. She could provide first-hand accounts of his strategies for undermining Amara, evidence of his deception, and testimony about his true character when he thought no one was watching. But even with this unexpected ally, the legal battle was far from over. Richard's team had been building their case for months, and they had resources and connections that put Amara at a significant disadvantage. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following month, and both sides knew it would likely determine the outcome of the entire divorce. Richard was confident that his character assassination campaign had been successful and that Amara would be forced to accept his terms. He had underestimated the woman he had tried so hard to erase. The Amara who walked into that conference room was not the same person who had been humiliated at the charity gala 6 months earlier. This was a woman who had been tested by fire and emerged with clarity about her own worth and determination to fight for her right to exist authentically in the world. The battle was about to reach its climax, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Amara felt ready for the fight. Chapter 4. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room on the 15th floor of a downtown office building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Amara could see the city spread out below her, bustling with life and possibility. She drew strength from that view, reminding herself that there was a whole world beyond this room where her worth wasn't determined by Richard's opinion of her. Richard arrived with his legal team looking confident and well-prepared. He wore his most expensive suit and the charming smile that had once made her feel special. Now, seeing him across the conference table, Amara marveled at how small he appeared. For months, he had loomed in her mind like an insurmountable obstacle. In reality, he was just a man who had confused cruelty with power. Lisa Rodriguez had prepared Amara thoroughly for this moment. They had documentation of every financial manipulation, witness statements about Richard's character assassination campaign, and Jessica's devastating testimony about what she had observed and discovered. "Remember," Lisa had coached her, "this isn't about proving you're perfect. It's about proving you're telling the truth." Richard's attorney began with a presentation that painted Amara as an unstable woman who had fabricated abuse allegations to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. They characterized her public speaking as attention-seeking behavior and her documentation efforts as obsessive paranoia. "Mrs. Sinclair has created an elaborate fantasy," the attorney argued, in which she is the victim of a vast conspiracy, rather than simply a woman whose marriage ended badly. Her allegations are unsupported by evidence and contradict the observations of numerous witnesses who describe Mr. Sinclair as a patient and long-suffering husband. But when Lisa Rodriguez stood to present Amara's case, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. She began with the bank records that showed systematic financial manipulation over 18 months. She presented communications that revealed Richard's deliberate campaign to undermine Amara's credibility. She played recordings of conversations where Richard coached Jessica on how to respond to questions about Amara's mental state. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Richard's confident expression began to crack as Lisa methodically dismantled his narrative piece by piece. Then came Jessica's testimony. Her voice was steady but emotional as she described discovering the truth about Richard's campaign against Amara. "He told me that Amara was delusional and potentially dangerous," Jessica explained to the room. "He said she was harassing him and making false accusations because she couldn't accept that their marriage was over. I believed him because he seemed so reasonable and concerned. But then, I found text messages on his phone that showed he was deliberately planning strategies to make her appear unstable." Jessica went on to describe Richard's manipulation tactics, his lies about the timeline of their relationship, and his attempts to use her as a weapon against Amara. "When I confronted him about the inconsistencies in his story," Jessica continued, "he turned the same tactics on me. Suddenly, I was too emotional and didn't understand. That's when I realized that what Amara had been describing wasn't paranoia. It was exactly what he had done to her, and he was starting to do it to me." The psychological evaluation results, when they were presented, completely contradicted Richard's claims about Amara's mental state. Dr. Williams' report described Amara as intelligent, articulate, and emotionally resilient, noting that her responses to extreme stress were normal and appropriate. "There is no evidence of the kind of mental instability that would compromise Mrs. Sinclair's judgment or credibility," the report concluded. "What I observed was someone who has been systematically manipulated, responding with remarkable clarity and strength." As the evidence mounted against him, Richard's carefully constructed facade began to crumble entirely. His attorneys exchanged worried glances, and his confident demeanor transformed into barely controlled anger. When given the opportunity to respond, Richard made a crucial mistake. Instead of maintaining his role as the concerned husband, he revealed his true nature. His voice rose as he accused Amara of poisoning Jessica against him, of manipulating the evidence, of being vindictive and destructive. "She's trying to destroy me because she can't accept that I moved on," he said, his mask slipping completely. "She's jealous and bitter, and she's willing to lie about anything to get revenge." The Richard who sat in that conference room was not the charming, reasonable man who had convinced their social circle that Amara was unstable. This was someone whose need for control had been threatened, and his response was both revealing and damaging to his case. But the moment that truly changed everything came when Richard's attorney made an offer that revealed the depth of his client's desperation. They were willing to offer Amara a substantial financial settlement, more than she had ever expected to receive, but it came with conditions that went beyond a typical non-disclosure agreement. Richard wanted Amara to publicly retract her statements about emotional abuse. He wanted her to issue a statement saying that she had been confused and overwhelmed and had misunderstood his actions. He wanted her to apologize for false accusations and to credit him with patience and understanding during her difficult time. The offer was financially generous enough to solve all of Amara's immediate problems. She could have security, stability, and an end to the public battle. All she had to do was allow Richard to rewrite the story of their marriage and accept responsibility for her own victimization. Lisa looked at her client, waiting for her response. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 15 floors below. Amare thought about the letters in Eleanor's shoebox, about the women who had found courage through her story, about the community center workshops that were helping other survivors recognize and address abuse. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, small, apologetic, desperate for approval, and the woman she had become through this painful journey. "No," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear. "I won't do it." Richard's attorney looked surprised. "Mrs. Sinclair, this is an extremely generous offer. You should consider the practical advantages of accepting these terms." "I have considered them," Amara replied, meeting Richard's eyes directly for the first time in months, "and I'm declining. I won't lie about what happened to me. I won't take responsibility for your choices, and I won't let you use my silence to harm other women." Richard's face flushed with anger and disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Amara. You're throwing away your future for some misguided principles." "No," she said with complete certainty. "I'm claiming my future. For the first time in 20 years, I'm choosing truth over comfort and integrity over security." The negotiation continued for several more hours, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Richard's team knew their client had been exposed, and Amara's resolve had made it clear that she would rather lose everything than participate in her own erasure. The final settlement, when it was reached, was fair and equitable. Amara received her portion of their shared assets without the degrading conditions Richard had demanded. More importantly, she maintained the right to tell her story and continue her advocacy work. As they signed the final papers, Richard made one last attempt at manipulation. "I hope you're satisfied," he said with the petulant tone of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions. "You've destroyed everything we built together." Amara looked at him with something approaching pity. "Richard," she said gently, "you destroyed what we built the moment you decided I was disposable. I'm just refusing to disappear quietly." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Amara stood once again outside the brass doors of the Riverside Country Club. But this time, she wasn't trembling with fear and confusion. She was returning as the keynote speaker for the inaugural fundraising gala of the Weathered Rose Foundation, the nonprofit she had established to help women recognize and escape emotional abuse. She wore a different dress this time, deep purple instead of emerald green, and her grandmother's pearls had been replaced by a simple necklace that Jessica had given her as a thank you gift. Jessica had become not just a volunteer with the foundation, but a close friend who understood the journey from manipulation to clarity. The ballroom looked exactly as it had the night of her humiliation, but everything else had changed. Instead of feeling like an intruder in her own life, Amara walked through those doors with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. The audience for her keynote address included many of the same people who had witnessed her public humiliation almost 2 years earlier. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared genuinely interested, and a few seemed inspired by the transformation they were witnessing. Eleanor Thompson sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Amara took the stage. Sandy was there too, along with Lisa Rodriguez and dozens of women whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. 2 years ago, Amara began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, I stood in this same room as a woman who had been systematically erased from her own life. I was told I was crazy, unstable, and delusional. I was banned from events I had organized, removed from accounts I had helped fund, and isolated from friends I had known for decades. She paused, looking out at the audience with complete composure. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that a woman's worth is not determined by how others choose to treat her. My value was never dependent on my husband's approval, my friend's comfort, or society's expectations. It was always mine to claim. The speech that followed was both personal and universal, addressing the specific patterns of emotional abuse while celebrating the strength and resilience that every woman possesses. Amara spoke about the difference between being nice and being strong, between keeping peace and seeking justice. The Weathered Rose Foundation exists because no woman should have to navigate abuse alone, she concluded. We're here to provide resources, support, and most importantly, validation that your experiences are real, your perceptions are valid, and your healing matters. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but more important than the applause were the conversations that happened afterward as women approached Amara to share their own stories, ask for resources, or simply say thank you for giving them language for experiences they had never been able to name. Richard was notably absent from the event. He had moved to another city after the divorce, his reputation in shambles and his social standing destroyed by his own actions. Jessica had heard through mutual acquaintances that he was dating someone new, a woman roughly her age who didn't know about his history. Should we warn her? Jessica had asked Amara when they discussed this development. Amara had considered the question carefully. We can't save everyone, she had finally replied, but we can make sure that when she's ready to hear the truth, there will be resources available to help her understand what's happening to her. The foundation had helped over 200 women in its first year of operation. Some had left abusive relationships, others had learned to recognize and address emotional manipulation, and many had simply found validation for experiences they had thought were their fault. Dr. Patricia Williams had joined the foundation's board, providing professional expertise about the psychological impact of emotional abuse. Lisa Rodriguez offered legal workshops about financial protection and divorce proceedings. Eleanor Thompson had become the volunteer coordinator, bringing her decades of experience working with women in crisis. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success was the network of women who had found each other through the Foundation's programs. Support groups, mentorship programs, and advocacy efforts had created a community of survivors who understood that healing was not a destination, but a journey, and that strength came not from perfection, but from authenticity. As Amara drove home from the gala that night, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had been banned from a charity gala had become someone who organized events to fund meaningful change. The wife who had been discarded and replaced had discovered that her worth was not dependent on anyone else's recognition. Her life looked completely different now. She lived in a smaller house, but she owned it outright. Her consulting practice had flourished as organizations sought her expertise on workplace culture and leadership development. Her relationships were deeper and more authentic, built on truth rather than appearance. Most importantly, she had learned the difference between being loved and being valued. Richard had claimed to love her while systematically devaluing everything about her. Now she was surrounded by people who valued her thoughts, respected her experiences, and celebrated her strength. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had not been linear or easy. There were still days when the old patterns of thinking surfaced, moments when she questioned her worth or worried about other people's opinions. But she had learned to recognize these thoughts as echoes of old programming, not reflections of current reality. Amara's journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest humiliation becomes the catalyst for our greatest transformation. If her story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them. In the comments below, share what moment in your life forced you to choose between comfort and authenticity. Your story might be the encouragement another woman needs to choose courage. And remember to subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more tales of resilience, transformation, and the incredible strength that lives inside every woman's heart. Your journey matters. Your voice has power, and your story can change lives. including your own. As she pulled into her driveway, Amara caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her had earned every line around her eyes, every streak of silver in her hair, every moment of peace in her expression. She was a weathered rose, not damaged by the storms she had survived, but made more beautiful by them. She thought about the women who would attend next month's support group meeting, the ones who were just beginning to recognize their own worth, and the ones who were still trapped in situations they didn't yet know how to name. Her story had become a bridge for their healing, just as other women's stories had been bridges for hers. The house was quiet as she unlocked the front door, but it was the peaceful quiet of sanctuary, not the oppressive silence of walking on eggshells. This was her space, filled with things she had chosen, arranged according to her preferences, and shared only with people who honored her presence in their lives. Before going to bed, Amara did something she had started doing every night since the divorce was finalized. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror and spoke directly to her reflection. "I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now I know it means healing from the break and helping others do the same. The weathered rose isn't damaged. It's experienced, resilient, and more beautiful for having survived the storms." Tonight, as every night, her reflection smiled back with genuine contentment. She had reclaimed her story, rebuilt her life, and discovered that the woman she was always meant to be had been there all along, waiting patiently for permission to exist authentically in the world. The transformation was complete, but the journey continued, and for the first time in decades, Amara was excited to see where it would lead her next.